young man in a Corvette was on his way to Southern Illinois University, and he pulled up in front of the store in a small town in Southern Illinois to ask directions from an old man sitting on the bench. This is in days before GPS, and he had gotten lost because of a detour. He asked the old man, "How do I get to Carbondale?" And the old man said, "I don't really know because I've never been there." So the young man asked if he had any idea which way to go, and the old man said that some people would go south to Chester and then follow things down from there. Others would head southeast to Sparta, and then he said, "But I don't know beyond there because I've only been to those two towns once, and I don't know where you go from there." So the young man, being a smart, wise guy, said, "Well, you don't really know too much, do you?" And he said, "Yeah, that's probably true, but I'm not the one who's lost." Today I'm not preaching on our Palm Sunday text, but continuing our series on the parable of Luke. But these parables about lost things and lost people were the reason why God sent Jesus down to Jerusalem in that Holy Week. There was a plan of salvation that needed to take place. And while it was a triumphant ending, or beginning, it was a rather downer ending to the week until Easter Sunday. But it shows God's great love. One of the criticisms of Jesus by the leaders of the Jews was that he spent an awful lot of time in the company of people that they would not get caught dead being with. They were the sinners. And the leaders of the Jews tried to isolate themselves as much as possible from these people because they thought that maybe sin was contagious. They were afraid of having a tarnished image if they got near these people. Jesus took another tack about things. He was careful to make sure that he was not participating in their sin, nor was he giving an approval of their sin. But he knew that in order to reach these people, he needed to be a doctor who was ministering to the sick, those who are lost in sin. His goal was to rescue the lost. And this was made clear when he told these parables designed to answer the leaders' criticism. First, he expressed the feeling of a shepherd who, after losing one of his sheep, spends time going out into the hillside to find it. And when he does, he rejoices by carrying it back and telling everybody his joy. He follows that up with a parable about a woman who lost a coin. Some think it was the coin belonged in a dowry headpiece. This is signifying that this was a married woman. And she wanted to find it as quickly as possible. It's like losing a wedding band or an engagement ring. She swept the whole house until she found it, and then when she found it, she went out and told everybody her joy. Then Jesus tells the story about the lost son. He perhaps had a selfish heart. He told his father, "I can't wait until you're dead. I want my share of the inheritance." He went out and he blew his money as fast as he could, and then things turned black. When he finally came to his senses, we're told, he realized that even the servants of his father's house were treated better than he was. And so he would go back as a servant if his father would accept him. And when the father sees him coming, he rejoices because the son who was lost has come back home. And he throws a big party simply because he is so joyful over his son's return. The Greek word for lost is repeated a number of times in the Gospel of Luke. But it means different things for different settings. Interestingly enough, we're told that when Jesus confronted the the man who was demon-possessed in Luke 4, that the man said to him as he approached, "Have you come to destroy us?" And we discover it's the same word. To be lost is to be destroyed. And then there is the time when he was told that he and his disciples were not following the purity laws of the Pharisees. And he talked to them about the fact that you don't patch old clothes with new cloth, because it will end up pulling the old cloth and destroying it. And you don't patch up old wineskins and put new wine in it, because it will expand and destroy the whole thing. And the idea here is that to be lost means to disintegrate. On another occasion, he spoke to his disciples about how easy it was for people to hold on to their lives, but then eventually lose them because they've done nothing spiritually. Whereas those who have given their lives to him will have eternal life, the joy in this life. In a sense, he's talking about the fact that they are wasting their life chasing after the wrong things. But if they waste their life serving him, they will have a reward throughout all eternity. When you come to the parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, it's easy to see that each of the lost items has something in common, even though they are different. They're not in the right environment. They're not where they belong. Translated into the experience of people we know, many times we discover that there's a certain element of disorientation that occurs. People who go to therapists will often talk to them about the fact that their life is out of whack, that their relationships have gone downhill, that somehow they're spinning their wheels in life and not accomplishing what they want to accomplish. And they come to this person partly because they realize they cannot change this on their own. In many respects, we discover that disintegration, if we think about it in the way we define it, is often falling apart or coming apart at the seams. And that's a very appropriate definition. But the fact is, the opposite of disintegration is integration, which means holding together. And one commentator talks about the fact that this word means, if you put yourself in terms of a wheel, the hub holds the wheel together. When the hub isn't there, the wheel falls apart. In other words, when God is not at the center of our lives, everything starts falling apart. Maybe not initially, but eventually it will. The woman who lost her coin certainly didn't want to lose it. The coin obviously didn't want to be lost. The sheep didn't really want to be lost. The son, we'll get to the son. First of all, the coin. How does a coin get lost? Sometimes it's a matter that a coin gets placed somewhere, maybe on a table or a counter. And it's very easy for it to perhaps get knocked off when someone reaches for something else, and it gets pushed to the side, maybe under something, or falls on the floor. Or the way I lose coins most often is I have them in my pocket and I go to reach for something else. I pull out my keys and coins flop on the floor. And being round, they bounce and they roll. Very easy to get lost. Sheep are a little bit different in that they tend to get lost because they're hungry, not well cared for, or because someone leaves a gate open and they wander off. Sheep are prone to wander. Now, there's a lot of human beings that are prone to wander too. And then we get to the parable of the lost son, and suddenly we see something very different. Because his lostness is by design. His lostness comes because he wants to live the high life. He doesn't want to be under his father's care, under his father's orders. He wants to live his life the way he wants it. He asks for his money, he goes, it ends up being wasted, as so often happens. Interestingly enough, there was something on the internet, advice that someone had won the lottery, the big lottery. Some of the first things they need to do and things is to shut your mouth. Don't let anyone know you want it, because there's going to be people who want it. Make your plans, get a good advisor, do all kinds of things that need to be done. And this young man, getting his inheritance, broke all the rules. It was gone. A famine comes, and he finds himself in a very bitter situation. But he was there because of his own choice. The attitude of Jesus to this universal state of lostness was clearly chronicled by his actions as well as his words. In the parable of the coin and of the sheep, we find rejoicing. And in the lost son, there's an even bigger part of this drama. The joy in heaven over those who are won back into the fold. We get an idea that the master is very persistent. God wants lost people found. And that's good news for those who are lost when they begin to understand that they're lost. And even before they realize that they're lost, because God is often at work in ways that they don't realize, setting the stage for their possible redemption. He's preparing people to minister to them, to win them back. He's setting the stage in their life. You might even say God was setting the stage with a famine in the life of the lost son. Because somewhere along the line, he was going to have to come to his senses and realize he could not go on the way he was. But God is there. God is at work. God is persistently trying to win back those who are lost. The master insisted that he was seeking the lost, but also that the lost must seek the Father. Because this is one of the things about the parable of the lost son. The father knew he couldn't change his son's mind, so he stayed back at home. Take note that he's watching for him. But he knew that his son had to come to terms with where he was. We know very well from 12-step programs that many people do not turn their life around until they hit rock bottom. Until they are able to admit that they can't go on the way they're going, that they cannot do the things like they've been doing them. You might try and help someone like that, but if they're not ready, they waste the help. The son had to come back and say to his father, I've really messed up. And you notice he came back to his father and he said, I'm willing to be a servant, not a son. I know that I've blown my share of the inheritance. That's a very important step. Now, it doesn't appear that the father left it that way. But the fact is, we have to come to terms with the consequences of life. I told you before, I once had a young man come to me in Warren, Pennsylvania, telling me that after he became a Christian, he felt that God had forgiven all of his sins and all of his debts. Therefore, he did not have to pay child support. It doesn't work that way. There are debts that we have to pay. There may be forgiveness. There may be a lot of help. God may blunt the effect of some of the consequences of our sin. But there are a lot of things that continue to have to be paid. But God continues to help us and support us and make ways possible for us to move on. The involvement of the Son in this ministry is beautifully expressed in each of the parables by talking about his love, his rejoicing. And that's something that we need to be very careful of, because we see here that the Pharisees were exclusively concerned about their own purity and maintaining their own integrity. And that's an important thing for us to see. One commentator was pointing out the fact that many times in Christian ministry, we have to be careful to safeguard our ministries, because when you're ministering to broken and hurting people, it's easy for you to get caught up in the emotions of the time and move in directions that are not appropriate. Pastoral counselors are told repeatedly that transference can occur on their part or the person they're counseling. And relationships can be formed, if they are not careful, that are inappropriate. There needs to be a safeguarding. Churches need to be making sure that they've done things. For example, this last week, our covenant ministers from our district met in Galesburg, and I was talking to the pastor of the Galesburg Covenant Church, because he's on our board of camping, Harbor Point Ministries, and I said, Tom, what is our camps doing to make sure we don't have the problem we ran into in Colorado? The Midwest Conference lost their camp in Colorado. The state came in, shut it down, and made an edict that the conference cannot run a camp in Colorado ever again. Why? Because they hired somebody that was not fully vetted. That person acted up. He pulled a knife on his campers. And then the following year, there was inappropriate sexual behavior on the part of another counselor. Neither of those got properly reported. And so the state said, we can't trust you to run a camp. Therefore, you have to sell it, and you have to get out of the business. Proper safeguardings are important. What Jesus would say is, you make sure that your heart and your mind is safeguarded by staying in the Word of God, by following the will of God, by making sure that you've taken the proper procedures, and then you can reach out to the lost and the broken. They won't drag you down. Rather, you will drag them up. It's the power of your spiritual benefit that brings them up. It's our trust in Christ that allows us to minister to the bruised and the broken. It's the power of Christ at work in us that makes the difference. Now that comes to the end of what we're looking at today. And that is, I didn't have Jim read the last couple verses in the text. It was already getting long. But it's about the older brother who's not too happy to have his kid brother show up. What he sees is his father is spending his money, that is his share of the inheritance, and throwing a big party. In one sense, he's just as bad as his younger brother. His father's not dead yet. It's his father's money until he dies. What the father does with it is the father's choice. The fact is, we in the church often are more like the Pharisees than like Jesus. That older brother was saying, I'm not sure that sinners like my brother should ever be able to be forgiven. I've been the good son. I've done things the right way. Why is my father even letting him come back? Now, if you think that's a little extreme, take a look at church ministry. One pastor tells about a split in their congregation that occurred because they wanted to start some 12-step programs as an extension of their ministry. And there was a group of people who said, not on our dime. We're not going to let those kinds of people come into our church building. They might not treat it with respect. After all, they've made a mess of their lives. Why should we let them in our building? Very often we find ourselves in many small ways acting just like the elder brother in ministry. Churches are constantly plagued with this. Christians have a tendency of looking down their nose at those who are broken and fallen and lost. We've got to fight that. Yes, there's appropriate response, and sometimes you need to be very careful. You have to set safeguards to make sure that the ministry doesn't go in a direction you don't want it to go. I mean, we set up a safeguard as a congregation by having 3 people count our offering every Sunday. There's witnesses. They see what each other is doing. They can testify that they're not skimming money off the top. It's one of the things you do. You make sure there's safeguards. But you also minister to the broken. And sometimes ministry to the broken is difficult. Because the broken, when they're redeemed, don't always get redeemed quite quick enough for everybody. Very often, some of the bad habits have to be worked at chronologically. They don't all just disappear at once. Language has to change. Maybe behavior has to change. Addictions have to be worked at and go through some times of failure and falling apart. But the fact is, we are called to minister to the broken and the lost in our society. And if we're not careful as a church, too often we have a tendency of being more like the Pharisees than like Jesus. Think about that as we look to future ministry. What does the ministry of Jesus Christ look like? Not just what ministry is comfortable to us, but what does the ministry of Christ look like? How might we need to change our ministry so that we are not like the people on Palm Sunday who are cheering Jesus on, but as soon as things didn't go quite their way, they're saying, crucify him, crucify him. As a pastor, I can guarantee you, since I've experienced it myself, there are times in church ministry when you make a decision to go the direction you think God wants your church to go. Only to have people in the church literally saying, crucify him, get rid of him. Sometimes you ask the question, why does someone leave church ministry? And it often is because they're mad about something that has happened. They don't like the way the church is being used because the wrong people are being ministered to. This is a very challenging text. What does it mean to find and minister to the broken and the lost?